you are a startup or a big company. There are some key essential advice to follow. And especially in the entertainment and AI business, there's so much creativity, there's so much innovation.
Donc là, j'ai une demi-heure avant le prochain. Voulez-vous monter en haut puis vous pratiquer ou comment vous voulez faire ça? Parce qu'ici, c'est tranquille, il y a des petites tables, il y a des petits sofas.
It's a very multidisciplinary field. And on top of that, there's a lot of new dimension now in the entertainment and AI business, and I'm not gonna you know very well about the AI algorithm, the metaverse, the virtual reality.
C'est toujours mieux quand on sait dans quoi on s'en va.
Avatars. Have you made your avatar already, Éric?
Yes, actually.
Really?
C'était au 5e. Ouais, puis je pense pas qu'il y ait rien qui vous bloque. Me le direz si c'est le cas. Mais moi, il y avait personne qui empêchait vraiment. Là. Ou sinon, je peux me présenter à l'ascenseur.
Really?
It was a very interesting experience.
Donc c'est
starting to ask questions how to protect the IP in the metaverse.
Definitely. So although we're going into new dimension now with the metaverse and the NFT and all that kind of new technology, you know, there's always IP behind this, and it's not as if there are new concept really, but it's deployed in new dimension, and you have to be prepared for that. So here's a few advice for you. Actually, we have 8 advice for you, or key elements that you should bear in mind. So the first one is IP ownership, and Éric and I are every day bombarded about questions about ownership, and there are very practical tips that you should know about to avoid question about your ownership. And why is it so important? First of all, ownership means money, right? Because if you co-own your innovation as opposed to be the full owner, it will have an impact on the value and the revenue that you will gain from your innovation. So ownership means value, means money. And sooner or later, you'll be faced with due diligence, either because you want financing, or you get into a transaction, or you want to license your technology, your innovation. So in all these contexts, people will ask you whether you are the owner of your IP. So better be prepared to face that kind of situation. And on top of it, if you want to enforce your IP, if you want to go after a competitor who's getting too close to you, IP ownership will be very important. So the question is, are you the IP owner or a co-owner? And often when we deal with startups and even bigger size of a company, and we go through the history, we find that the ownership is not necessarily well documented, and we have to go back in history to get some assignment signed by everybody that has been involved, right?
And it's not because you paid for something that automatically you own it.
Right.
And that's one of the common mistakes I see very often in these projects. People pay to develop a technology, and there is no written assignment of the resulting IP.
Correct. That's definitely, that's why actually we put it as a number 1 advice, because that's so frequent. So if you deal with a consultant and you pay, just like Éric said, doesn't mean that you own the technology, that you own the IP that the consultant has created. So you have to make sure that to have an assignment in writing. And the same with your friends and family who help you out. Yes. Often at the very beginning of a business, you'll trade a beer or something to get some advice or some input from your web designer friend. So be aware that your web designer friend may have some IP. So maybe a co-owner of your video game, your app, or whatever you're creating. So whether we talk about co-founders, friends and family, consultants, these people are not employees, and they have right if they contribute to your innovation. So very important. As for employees, the law is that if you create as an employee and during your employment, Normally it belongs to the employer, so the situation is a bit different, but still good employment agreement with IP assignment save a lot of trouble. Yeah, because sometimes an employee may go outside of the scope of its actual responsibilities and contribute, and that's where you fall into a gray zone. Last tip about ownership, don't forget about moral rights. Moral rights is often something that is put aside or forgotten. So anybody who create some copyright material, they still have moral rights, which means that you as a business, you cannot do whatever you want with your work. You cannot modify it as you wish or even associate it with a cause without having the sign off from the author, right?
And that becomes very important when you have artistic form of IP because there is artistic value on the context where the work is used. And so that's very important to get a waiver of these moral rights, or at least to have some margin to use the work as you intend to use it as a business.
Definitely. So number 2 advice, your brand. This is my daily practice. Why should you invest in your brand? Too often people think, well, I have my incorporation, I don't have money, I have rights, because I use the brand, I've launched it and there is no problem. Well, the deal is that often, when you want to expand and export, that's where the problem becomes more important. So my advice to any business is, even before launching your product, you should invest in clearance searches. And although you do some own work by yourself and you're able to clear to a certain level your mark, be aware that the clearing a mark is a real work that has to be done by experts, because it's not only whether your mark is identical to another trademark that exists already. It's not only a matter of going on the trademark register, type in your mark, there's nothing coming up, so there's no problem. Too often people think that this is the case, and later on they realize that they may be in conflict, and should they have known at the very early stage, they could have avoided. So my number 1 advice as far as brand is concerned is invest in clearance searches. You may think it's costly, but it's more costly to launch a product and later on find out that because you wanted to save a few $100s, you have to withdraw your product from the market, because it can go as far as having to withdraw your product from the shelves and find a new brand. So think about how much money you spend in the creation of your brand, in the marketing tools that you put in place. All that, you won't think twice and you'll invest money. So don't forget the last step in the road, which is making sure that this brand that will become your passport to sell your products and services is not conflicting.
And you have to be careful to make sure that you look at all the potential markets for your products, because you might end up that it's okay to use your brand in Canada, in the United States, but when you want to go to Europe, if you've not cleared properly the brand, you might find out that somebody else has that brand in Europe, and that you have to have a different name or a different brand for the European market.
Sure. And although it may be costly when you add up all these searches in all the countries where you have an interest, what I like to do is actually, make a strategy of search. We cannot go all over the world. So there are ways and tools to actually get a good level of comfort without spending all your money, and make the minimal in some countries where you do have a real interest. the other thing about trademark is that it's very long to register a trademark in Canada. I think we're beating all the world record. It takes at least 3 years to get a registration in Canada. So the day you file, calculate at least 3 or 4 years before you get the final approval by the trademarks office. It doesn't mean that you cannot use your trademark meanwhile, but it means that it will take a long time before you actually know that it's clear, it's good, you have a monopoly in Canada, US, etc. So the sooner you file, the better. And again, the search that I've just spoke about give you the level of comfort to launch your product without having to wait 3 years, of course, because you don't want to delay that much your launch. So good searchers, filing as soon as possible because it's very long to get the sign off from the trademarks office, and a new incentive to file as soon as possible is the Charter for French Language. As you surely know, there's been a lot of amendments that have been adopted a couple of years, actually June 1st. And there's been a lot of media coverage on the Charter for French Language, a lot of debates, but not a lot of people have heard about the changes in as far as trademarks are concerned. So just so you know, if you use a non-French trademark in Quebec, it has to be registered. Otherwise, you will have to add a French translation, which is not normally what a brand owner wants to do. A brand is supposed to be universal without translating it in every country where you do business. So thank God the government, when they adopted the Charter for French Language and the new rules for trademarks, they give you a window of 3 years to transition and get your registration. So the clock is ticking, and if you're using, as we speak, or intend to use a trademark that is not in French in Quebec, you should definitely hurry and take action to file your application. Otherwise, in 3 years from now, you may end up having to translate it.
And by experience, you have to be careful, because it's not because you've forged a new word that the Quebec's government will not interpret that word as an English word. So when you want to use something that is not necessarily in English, but a mix of sound that sound English or sound foreign, then you might be better to register the trademark.
Yeah, actually, my 30-second on the Charter for French Language, on top of what I've just said, is that basically the government wants the commercial landscape to be in French. The only exception is trademarks, and if it's not registered, you'll be in trouble, so to speak, and you'll have to adjust. So that's again another incentive. Number 3 advice: copyrights. You know, as soon as you create something, whether it's a website, whether it's a play, it's a video game, name it, you do have copyrights. If you have consultants helping you, again, make sure that they assign their rights. And one advice that I have to give you about copyright is to remember that you can get inspired by anybody, it's okay, but copying is not. Everybody knows that, but too often we see some pieces of copyright taken here and there. Just an image, just a photo, just a video, just a short portion of someone else's website, or be careful with that. As soon as you take someone else's creation, you may be in copyright infringement. So the basic advice is do not use someone else's work without permission, and be careful with all the database with images and photos that you think you can use. There's always small print there. Don't forget, you see on the slide, read the small print and terms and condition. often there will be restrictions there, meaning that you cannot use this image for commercial use. It's okay to use it for your personal use. So don't forget to read the small terms, the small prints. Now to you, Éric, with open source.
Well, it goes in line with the notion of copyright. A lot of code that we use when we program is open source. Most of the solutions today, software solutions, are built with several pieces of open source code, libraries, and not all the open source are equal. For one thing, it's not because you find it on the web that you can actually use it commercially. Some open source license prohibit any commercial use. And you have to read, once again, the small prints and decide if you can use it commercially or not. Also, some open source license forces you to distribute your own code, what you are going to create, also on the same open source license or on a compatible open source license. So if you want to have exclusivity of your code, then some type of open source license are not recommended. And for example, if you're coding and you want to use a GPL library under GPL license, it could be problematic in some cases, while Apache MIT license are not so problematic. And there's an obligation to display that when you're using open source technology. It's very important to follow the rules. So read the small terms and conditions, and also think about what is your strategy in light of open source, because you can decide that you want to contribute to the open source world and contribute by allowing other parties to use your code. It could be a way to make it more accepted in an industry, but you don't have exclusivity in that case. So you have to decide what's your strategy.
So basically, as long as you know what you're getting into and you're fully aware, that's fine. But too often people overlook the small print, yes, and maybe faced with a situation that they didn't want to be into, for sure. And now personal data.
Oh, that's also one of the very common mistakes that we see for AI technology or AI-related technology. AI is very often built on mass of data, and we have in Canada, but also in the US, in Europe, laws pertaining to privacy that protects personal information, and that's a very broad concept. You have very sensitive information, or for example, medical information, or financial, or information on the religion of the people. But you also have very broad personal information, which is also protected. It's not as sensitive, but email, residential address, telephone numbers, all this information can be personal information. So when you collect personal information, you need to have the consent of the people who are going to be collected from the standpoint of the personal data. You have to get consent, and you cannot go to what we used to see, where people would sign a consent saying, but basically, you can take my information and do about anything about it. So nowadays, you need to have specific consent. You're going to use the information for this and this purpose, and you cannot use it for other purpose, and you cannot keep it forever in your databases. So you need to think about these issues when you build the solution. It's not an afterthought. It's something that is so fundamental that, for example, one of my clients had developed a technology and it was already operating, but they had to do a major redesign on the infrastructure of the technology because they were keeping way too much personal information. They were using it beyond the consent, and they had to take almost a 2-year step back.
Wow.
Because of the privacy laws that
So
applied to their solution.
If they had known beforehand and got the proper advice, they would have avoided.
They would have avoided that kind of catastrophic situation where they lost a lot of money just
Sure.
redesigning the solution.
Wow.
So
That's
talk to
huge.
the lawyers.
Sure.
soon.
and what about the cookies? I'm just curious about cookies. When you know, I accept the cookies, and you know, there's a lot of trick in there, right?
Yes, you have to think about, for one thing, you are required now to display an acceptance of cookies, which is very clear on the website. It also needs to be very specific of what you're going to do with the cookies. But beyond the next few years, a lot of people are asking, are these cookies really useful? Are they such of value that they are worth the trouble of having all these acceptance forms when you get to a website?
Yeah.
And one of the things that we have to keep in mind is that the web browser are moving toward restricting the use of the cookies. The tracking cookies are going to be very restricted by default on the next generations of web browsers. So it might not be the best tool if you look on the long term.
Yeah. All right, let's move on to trade secrets and confidential information.
Trade secrets. Well, that's often the forgotten child of intellectual property. When you work for years developing your solution and you have all these internal memos, market studies, data that you've been using to train your AI technology, methods that you use internally, these are of value. You don't want your competitor to jump in and have access to all this information. That's something that's very important to protect, to have NDAs, to make sure that you don't disclose it too fast to your partners, and just to disclose it to those who really need to have this information.
Yeah.
It's not normal, and I've seen it so often, that every employee has access to every piece of information, every details of the method, the trade secret.
Wow.
It doesn't make sense. And keep in mind also that your code, when you are a developer, is part of copyright, but it can also be kept as a trade secret. So, for example, in a SaaS solution, the backend, what the users don't see, is a trade secret. So you don't need to disclose it to everybody unless you've taken an engagement to disclose it because you're using an open source technology.
That brings us to cybersecurity.
Well, we talked about personal information, we talked about trade secrets. Now, in real life, how do we protect them? Well, you need cybersecurity. And that's not IP per se, but it is how you protect your IP. Because if you have a security breach, like one of my clients had last week, and which kept me busy most of the week last week, you can find out that actually the information that was extracted from your servers include, well, the personal data of your employees, your clients, and also all your trade secrets. And these hackers, well, they're not trustworthy people, they're criminals, so they want to resell it. They might ask you a ransom to keep it secret, but once again, even if you pay the ransom, there's nothing that prevents them from reselling the information to competitors, especially competitors in other countries. So that's a very risky thing not to think about cybersecurity, and it's something that has to be taken into account from the start. You need to think about your solution.
And actually, it's funny that you're talking about the the situation that you were handling last week, because I was trying to reach you and you said, I'm sorry, I'm on an emergency. And you were telling me actually that if the company had done put in place just a few IT measure, which are not necessarily costly, they would have avoided most likely this kind of attack. So it's not necessarily costly to have a robust infrastructure, correct?
Yes, and for example, 90% of the cybersecurity breach that we see nowadays could be avoided by using a two-factor authentication. I know it's annoying, you receive something on your cell phone to connect in addition to your password. So that can avoid a lot of trouble. And the other thing is just good human procedures. For example, if you receive an email which is weird and asks you to send the money to a bank account from a supplier and that you don't know, why don't you just pick up the phone? And there's training to do to your employees. Pick up the phone, talk to these service providers and ask them, is it true that we need to,
is it for real?
Is it for real? Do we really need to change your bank account?
Yeah. and the last point on the slide is that this kind of concern should be in continuous mind, because the technology evolves.
Yes.
So you can be safe today, but
yes.
you know, in a year from now,
the threats, and the threats keeps coming. We find sometimes, for example, breaches in the security of some elements that are integrated in other technology. Minecraft, for example, had to correct urgent cybersecurity breaches because they were using a library which had a fault in it, which allow hacker to take administrative control of the platform through a remote access. So you need to keep yourself informed.
Yeah, so little measures can save
lots
of
money.
Liability, money, and time and sweat.
Yes.
So I think we have a couple of minutes left. Last point is a strategic IP plan. You do business plan, you do strategic plan. IP is somewhere hidden in there. But I think it's a good practice to really take a moment and think about what about my IP, and really have a focus on that. After having spoke with experts, make a brainstorm with your team and try to prioritize. We understand that budget is a concern, and that you cannot do everything. So in an ideal world, you would follow all the advice that we give you, but we have to be realistic. We have to put in place priorities. And as we mentioned, when we talk about trademarks or cybersecurity measures, those do not require a lot of investment. And you can actually have a step-by-step plan. This year, it's crucial that we do this, and that will buy us time to do this next year. And we can put figures next to that to help you budget, because you may lose opportunities, you may run into conflicts which could have been avoided with very small investment. So I think that this is the final advice that we wanted to leave you with, because I think it's good to take a step back and say, do I have IP? Am I owner of the IP? And what should I do with this IP? And where is it essential that I do take some action now, and what can I do tomorrow or next year? So those are the advice we had for you. Here's the final checklist, which is a recap of what we've just mentioned. Ownership, make sure that you have a shareholder agreement, good employee agreement, consultant agreement with IP assignment, friends and family, more than beer, waiver for moral rights, for trademarks, clearance and filing as soon as possible, copyright, read the small print, do not copy personal data. You need consent and you need to consult. I believe it's so sensitive. Open source, again, make sure you know what you're getting into. Read the small print, consult if need be. Trade secrets, no disclosure without DNA. And cybersecurity, I think that Éric covered it very well. Do your IT homework and make sure that you do minimal measures and revisit that question on a periodic frequency. And finally, strategic IP planning. And do not hesitate to consult. Pick us brain. Come and
Talk
see
to
us.
the lawyers.
Yeah.
We're not that scary.
Yeah, exactly. So hope that was helpful for you, and hope to see you later at the bar de solution. All right. Have a nice EAI moment.